Poise is probably the most popular Souls mechanic among the academic community. If I were to guess, this could have something to do with the fact that it is a rather complex mechanic that has multiple subsystems within it. Poise made its first appearance in Dark Souls 1, and in that game, it was very powerful. Stacking Poise back then was a very efficient way to trivialize a lot of the enemies, and the same could be applied to some bosses. Arguably, we could say that Poise was too strong at that time, and it would seem that FromSoft would agree with this statement, as they have tried to balance Poise in every game that followed. Once Dark Souls 3 was released, we found that in that game, Poise was not really good at all. It was but a shadow of the initial mechanic that was introduced so many years before, and, in my opinion, it can be said that it became useless. Now, in the present, with Elden Ring's release, we find that FromSoft decided to make yet another attempt at balancing Poise, and in this case, they decided to use an approach dictated by compromise. By finding a sweet spot somewhere in the middle, Elden Ring's Poise system manages to give the player a tool that is definitely not as strong as it was in Dark Souls 1, but it is certainly much more useful than what we had in Dark Souls 3. And so, my dear viewer, we are going to go over this system and explore exactly what it does for the player. Let's get started. In order to be able to fully understand the mechanic, we first need to talk about what Poise actually is. As a mechanic, Poise represents the player character's balance in combat. It mainly affects us, the player, but tarnished NPCs must also follow its rules. Poise acts a lot like our HP, in the sense that it has a singular value and that it decreases when we get hit by an enemy. Our character's poise is mainly affected by the armor that we wear. The heavier the armor, the higher our poise, and that means that it will be harder for an enemy to break our balance. Now, poise is not a stand-alone mechanic. In fact, poise is part of a larger mechanical system that encompasses multiple sets of rules. The overarching general mechanic is poise. From there, we have to divide it into two sub-mechanics, which are stance and player poise. Stance within the game files is described by the parameter super armor, and player poise, again within the game files, is described by the parameter toughness. Stance or super armor is the sub-mechanic that affects PvE enemies, and poise or toughness is the sub-mechanic that affects the player characters. In essence, these two sub-mechanics are very similar, if not the same, and the only thing that changes between them is who they affect and what kind of effect they bring to the table. I have already analyzed stance in another video. If you're interested in that information, I will leave a link in the description so that you can access it. At this time, in this video, we will focus on the player side of the system. As such, we are going to be breaking down the player's poise. Let's start by going over some basic concepts that are general to a player's poise. First of all, it is important to understand that in Elden Ring, poise is passive. This means that players do not have to do anything to use poise or to activate it. It is always working. Whenever our character gets hit, poise is taken into consideration when the game decides what effects the attack will produce. Overall, passive poise is fantastic for the player, both offensively and defensively. The most obvious application is using poise to avoid getting caught in multiple enemy attacks that combo the player, but there are also many aggressive applications, like using it to trade blows with the enemy, sacrificing some personal harm in exchange for a much higher damage output that is inflicted on our target. Having poise be a passive tool makes it extremely valuable, and it definitely increases its utility. The other important thing to note is that in Elden Ring, poise is represented by a bloated value. In order to understand what this means, we have to start by knowing that the game shows us our character's poise in the stats page that it provides us. For example, this particular character has a total of 100 poise. Well, this number is technically incorrect. In fact, this character actually has a total of 10 poise. The value that the game shows us is bloated or inflated. Specifically, it is multiplied by 10. What you see is 100 poise, but for the purposes of the mechanic, the game actually uses 10 in its calculations. Elden Ring artificially increases the number in the stats page that the players can see. So the question is, why does it do this? Mechanically speaking, it has no implications. As mentioned before, the game already takes the raw, unbloated value into consideration. The larger number is just for the player to see, so I believe that it serves a psychological purpose. In this game, the Bull Goat's armor set gives the player the highest amount of poise possible at 100. This is supposed to represent that your character is very tanky and fully capable of shrugging off a hit or two. In reality, the poise is not 100, it is 10. But let's be honest, if the game showed 10 poise in the stats page, we would not feel very powerful at all. We would not think that the Bull Goat's armor set is the tankiest in the game. As such, the value is bloated to convey a message and to convince the player of their power. While this is simple to understand, it is very important to keep in mind. There are many internal calculations that are going on in regards to poise, and when looking into them, we have to remember to convert the bloated value back into its raw state, or vice versa. Otherwise, we will not get a true result. This is especially the case when it comes to poise damage. As we mentioned before, poise acts a lot like HP. In the same way that we lose HP if an enemy attacks us, we also take poise damage from that attack. For the purposes of how much poise damage our character takes from each attack, we have to differentiate between getting hit by a PvE enemy and getting hit by another player in PvP. In the cases of PvE enemies attacking the player, things are actually quite simple. Elden Ring streamlined things by grouping most enemy attacks into two groups. There is the group of attacks that deal 50 poise damage to the player, and there is the group of attacks that deal 100 poise damage to the player. The conclusion for PvE is simple. Enemies will either deal 50 or 100 poise damage to the player, and the attacks mostly follow common sense. Enemy attacks that look to be done with one hand or with lighter weapons will probably do 50 poise damage, while enemy attacks done with huge weapons or that have a long startup will most likely inflict the full 100. Finally, it is important to mention that some attacks ignore poise. By this, I mean that no matter how much poise your character actually has, they will not tank the hit. These are special cases and they are to be considered exceptions. Nevertheless, it is good to know that they exist. Pay attention as you battle, and you will get the hang of which attacks you need to roll and which attacks you can poise through. As for PvP, where players are attacking each other, things become a bit more complicated. In Elden Ring PvP, every single attack deals poise damage to the player. Melee attacks, Ashes of War, and spells, both sorceries and incantations, all deal poise damage. The amount of poise damage that each attack deals is decided on a case-by-case basis. Every single attack, Ash of War, sorcery, and incantation deals a specific amount of poise damage to us. In the case of weapons, it is divided by weapon types. For example, all greatswords deal the same amount of poise damage with their attacks. All greatswords are the same, their R2s are the same, so on and so forth. The same can be said for curved swords, great spears, fists, etc. Furthermore, some weapon attacks deal more poise damage than others. For most weapon types, R2s will deal more poise damage than R1s. In the same way, charged R2s will deal more damage than their uncharged counterparts. And if we want to maximize the amount of poise damage we can deal to a player with a weapon attack, we have to use jump attacks and guard counters. In regards to Ashes of War and spells, each and every one is different. For example, the R2 attack of the Unsheath Ash of War done with a katana deals a total of 300 poise damage, while the incantation Lightning Spear, after being charged to full, deals 124.8 points of poise damage. As mentioned before, the game does not tell us this anywhere, so if we are interested in knowing the specific poise damage of a particular attack, we have no choice but to look it up in the game files and figure it out ourselves. Now, if you're the type of player that intends to research the specific poise damage that each weapon attack can deal to the enemy, then it is important that we understand how the game calculates poise damage for each weapon. Most sources of information will give you the total poise damage already sorted out, but it is not a bad idea to understand how the process works. This is applicable to regular attacks from weapons as well as some Ashes of War. The formula to find the total poise damage of a specific weapon attack is as follows. Total poise damage is equal to base poise damage multiplied by the poise motion value multiplied by 10 multiplied by 1.35 if applicable. Let's break this down. The base poise damage is a predetermined value that Elden Ring gives to each weapon type. For example, greatswords. The game decided that this weapon type has a base poise damage of 5.5. As for motion values, I covered this concept in a prior video where we break down the system that Elden Ring uses to calculate its damage. If you're interested in a full explanation, do not hesitate to check it out. I will leave a link in the description. That said, for the purposes of this video, please understand that poise motion value is the representation of the force of an attack. Stronger attacks have a higher motion value than weaker attacks. Motion values are also predetermined by Elden Ring. Each attack has its own specific motion value. For example, the two-handed R1 of a Claymore has a motion value of 2.4. Now, we have this 10. Earlier in the video, we spoke about how poise in Elden Ring is a bloated value and that it was multiplied by 10 in order to inflate it and make it seem larger. Well, that is what this 10 represents. We have to transfer the raw values that the game starts with into the bloated values that the game shows the player. To do this, we multiply by 10. And finally, the 1.35. This value is the result of Elden Ring's patch 1.07. In this patch, the notes state that they improved poise damage in PvP for every weapon's normal attack, except for skills and long-ranged weapons. Specifically, this improvement turned out to be a 35% boost to poise damage, and that is represented by the additional multiplication of 1.35. With this said, remember that it only applies to a weapon's normal attack. Ashes of War do not receive this boost. So, if you are calculating the total poise damage for a weapon's normal attack in PvP, then you keep the 1.35. Otherwise, you have to take it out of the formula. Now that we understand this, let's calculate an example. We are going to find out the total poise damage of a Claymore two-handed R1 in a PvP scenario. First, we input the information into the formula. We already discussed that the base poise damage for a Claymore is 5.5 and that the motion value for a two-handed Claymore R1 is 2.4. Since this is considered a regular weapon attack, we have to apply the additional poise damage bonus of 1.35. This leaves us with the total poise damage being 5.5 multiplied by 2.4 multiplied by 10 multiplied by 1.35. The result is 178.2. This is the poise damage that we will receive, and we would need a total of 179 poise to be able to resist it. Like I said before, if you're looking up this information, you will most likely find it already calculated. That said, if you ever find yourself actually doing the work, then this is how it's done. Depending on how much poise our character has, we may be able to tank 1 or 2 hits from our enemies. That said, eventually, and with enough hits, our poise will deplete. It will hit 0. When this happens, our poise breaks. When it comes to the player character, getting our poise broken means that our character will stagger. In Elden Ring, there are many kinds of staggers and they follow their own system. Within the game, the type of stagger is decided by the damage level of the attack that hits us. Damage level is a subsystem of player poise, so we need to understand it. Starting at the beginning, what is a stagger? Well, a stagger is an interruption of player control. To put it simply, if you are staggered, you will not be able to do anything with your character until the stagger ends. Each type of stagger will stop you from doing anything for different amounts of time, going from as short as 1/3 of a second to as long as 3 full seconds. As such, it is important to be aware as to what kind of stagger we can expect. Not being able to move for 1/3 of a second may not seem like a big deal because, honestly, it isn't. On the other hand, being unable to move for 3 seconds, now that can present a problem. Damage level is a system that separates every attack in the game into different groups. Each group provides a different type of stagger, and that means that each group can lead to a different amount of interruption. As far as I could tell, there are 12 total damage level groups, from level 0 to level 11. Still, while the groups are all technically different, some of them actually have some similarities in regards to the stagger, so in order to avoid repetition, instead of going over each damage level group, we are going to review each type of stagger that can apply to the player. With each type of stagger, you will see its effects and the amount of time that you will be immobile for. In order to test the different types of staggers, I attacked different enemies. The reason is because in this way, I can control the damage level of the attacks by using the specific weapons and techniques required. The staggers that you see the enemies suffer will also apply to a player if they are hit with the same attack. Let's start with the basic staggers: quick stagger, short stagger, moderate stagger, long stagger, and the push stagger. The quick one represents the lightest stagger visually. It feels like a quick slap and it will keep you immobile for about 1/3 of a second. The best example of this type of stagger is being hit with a dagger R1. This stagger corresponds to damage level 8 within the game. The short stagger is a step above the quick one, and this is when you begin to see your character reel to the side. The differences are mostly visual because in essence, this stagger also keeps you immobile for about 1/3 of a second. It looks much more serious than it actually is. The best example for this kind of stagger is being hit with a straight sword R1. This stagger corresponds to damage level 1 within the game. The moderate stagger is when you should begin to worry. This is when your character starts to really feel the blow and is forced to take a small step back. Mechanically, this stagger will keep you immobile for almost a full second. The best example of this kind of stagger is being hit with a greatsword R1. This stagger corresponds to damage level 2 within the game. The long stagger represents the heaviest hit of all the basic staggers. It looks brutal. The character will be shaken heavily to the side and they will take a few steps back as they recover from the blow. Getting hit by one of these staggers will keep you immobile for a little bit over a full second. The best example for this kind of stagger is being hit with a colossal sword R1. This stagger represents damage level 3 within the game. And then there is the push stagger. This is a bit of a special type of stagger because it forces your character to take a few steps back in order to recover. It does not look like a big deal, but it is, because it is as troublesome as the long stagger. If our character suffers from a push stagger, they will be immobile for over a second. The best example for this kind of stagger is the kick, Ash of War. This stagger represents damage level 5 within the game. Moving on, there are some attacks that go beyond a stagger. In fact, they are so forceful that they have the special characteristic of knocking the character into the ground. Generally speaking, being hit by one of these attacks is an almost guaranteed poise break, and that means that your character will suffer the consequences. There are 3 types of knockdowns, and I like to call them the 3 Fs: the fling, the flat, and the flip. The fling knockdown is when your character is physically flung back after being hit by a really heavy attack. the character will drop to the ground and be forced to get back up, keeping them immobile for over 3 seconds. This is dangerous, and the best example of this type of knockdown is the Rejection incantation. This knockdown represents damage level 7 within the game. The Flat knockdown is when your character receives an attack from above that is so strong that they are pancaked or face planted into the ground. They are left flat and without being able to move for just under 2 seconds. It is almost as dangerous as the Fling knockdown, and the best example for this type is the Lion's Claw Ash of War. This knockdown represents damage level 6 within the game. And finally, the last F, the Flip knockdown. This is when your character gets sent into the air, flipping over and landing on the ground. This is painful to watch and just as dangerous to be on the receiving end. This knockdown will hold your character immobile for just under 3 seconds, so it is just as problematic as the Fling. The best example for this type of knockdown is the Giant Hunt Ash of War. This knockdown is represented by damage level 9 within the game. Okay, my dear viewer, by now you should know what poise is, how our character gets poise, how to calculate poise damage, and most importantly, what happens when our poise breaks. The next thing that we need to go over is the amount of poise that a player should have to feel safe. Let me be clear, it is impossible to poise through every single attack in the game. Some attacks deal way too much poise damage, so much in fact that it is impossible for us to reach the amount of poise with the tools that we currently have available. And then there are some other attacks that just simply ignore poise and they will always knock you down. That being said, we can determine the values or thresholds of poise that we should aim for in order to be able to resist most attacks in the game. As we have done before, when it comes to thresholds, we need to separate between PvE and PvP. The thresholds for PvE are actually very simple. If you remember, we established that the poise damage of PvE enemies are split into 2 groups. Those that deal 50 poise and those that deal 100 poise. Being this the case, it is obvious to realize that you should have 51 poise to be able to tank the simplest and most common attacks in the game, and then if you want to be extra safe and cover most of the PvE attacks that will be coming your way, then you should have 101 poise. Reaching this much poise is definitely an investment, but regardless of your intentions, the PvE thresholds are very clear to see, 51 and 101. Now, when it comes to PvP poise thresholds, things are much more complicated. Every single attack in the game deals a certain amount of poise damage in PvP. In fact, we already covered the formula for poise damage and how to calculate the exact amount of each attack. So now, we need to go through the data and reach a conclusion as to how much poise you should have to be on the safe side throughout your PvP playtime. Showing the exact poise damage of every single attack in the game would take a very long time, so instead we're going to focus on the basic poise damage of the different attacks that are the most common in a PvP scenario. Please take a look at this table. These values are the amount of poise that your character should have in order to be able to tank one hit of the corresponding weapon attack. Let's start here. You need to have 69 poise in order to be able to deal with power stance attacks from the faster weapons. Dual wield straight swords, curved swords, and spears are very good, so we are interested in being protected against these. Personally, I would start here and use this value as the lowest threshold. If I were to be making a PvP character, I would not go lower than 69 poise. Now let's move on to the next value, 75 poise. This lets us tank a hit from the two-handed R1 of straight swords, curved swords, and spears among other weapons. There is some merit to this threshold and it is worthwhile to push your poise an additional 6 points to meet it. 75 poise will also let you tank a single two-handed R1 from katanas too. There is use to it and it should definitely be considered. The next value I want to review is here, 101 poise. This allows us to tank a hit from Storm Stomp and Flaming Strike. These are very common and very powerful Ashes of War that generate a lot of damage in PvP. They are particularly useful in invasions as they allow for a bit of crowd control. I understand that the investment to reach 101 poise can be heavy, but I personally believe that it is very much worth it. Meeting this threshold does require that you use the Bulgo Talisman, but being able to push through these Ashes of War can give you a very big advantage in both duels and invasions. Furthermore, there might be merit in pushing your passive poise beyond 101 when we take into consideration poise reset through the use of hyper armor. That said, we are getting ahead of ourselves, and we will cover this particular concept later in the video. So, what can you take away from this? Well, you have to sit down and think about what you want from your character and see what kind of poise threshold suits you best. That being said, I would not go into a PvP battle without at least 69 poise. Furthermore, I would probably make the push to 101 for the additional safety against the troublesome Ashes of War that we spoke about. Of course, it can become difficult to meet these values exactly, so variations are to be expected. Not only this, there is also fashion to consider, so we may have to make some sacrifices in order to have a better looking character. In any case, whether you prefer stats or whether you prefer fashion, this is the basic information that you need to study to be able to make an educated decision. Now, poise is a self-reliant system, meaning that the player does not have to do anything in order to upkeep it. This is represented by the fact that the player character's poise recovers after certain conditions are met. The first thing to understand about this recovery is that it is a resetting property, not a regenerative property. By this, I mean that a player does not get their poise back little by little over time. Instead, player poise resets to a predetermined value immediately after a condition is met. Normally, when player poise resets, it recovers back to full. That said, there are cases in which poise does not return back to its maximum value. As for the conditions in which a player poise resets, there are three. There is the natural reset, the break reset, and the hyper armor reset. The natural reset represents the automatic poise recovery over time. As you know, once our character is hit, we lose some poise. Once this happens, a timer begins to count down. Specifically, it is a 30-second timer. Our character's poise will automatically reset to full regardless of its current value once this 30-second timer expires. Now, 30 seconds in the large scale of things is not a lot of time. That said, within the vacuum of Elden Ring, 30 seconds is actually an eternity. Actually, you know what? Let me show you. The character that you see here has exactly 51 poise. This will allow me to tank a single light attack from this Godric soldier. So first, I am going to get hit twice in order to confirm that 2 hits will break my poise. There. Now I am going to get hit once, leaving me at 1 poise. There's the hit. Finally, we avoid the enemy for 30 seconds. Ready? Timer start. And stop. With the timer expired, my poise should be back, and I should be able to tank another hit. As you can see, my character did not stagger. Now, that took a long time, didn't it? It was a horrible experience, wasn't it? Well, imagine doing this during a boss fight. 30 seconds is way too long for a natural poise reset to be any useful in battle. Sure, it will be valid during exploration, but don't expect much when it actually counts. The second way to get our poise to reset is the most simple to understand and the most common one that you will see throughout your time in the lands between. If your poise is broken, then it immediately and automatically resets back to its full value. Furthermore, the minimum poise that a character can have is 0. This sounds obvious, but it has very important implications. Whenever our character has its poise broken, regardless of how much poise damage it received, the break and the reset automatically happen when it hits 0. There is no bleed over mechanic, and leftover poise damage does not affect the fresh poise health. Once your character's poise hits 0, it is reset to full and any remaining poise damage is lost. This is very simple to demonstrate within the game, and you have been seeing it in action. The same 51 poise character is hit twice by the Soldier of Godric, and that breaks its poise, staggering it. After he recovers from the stagger, the same character is able to tank a single hit immediately. Now, this is simple, easy, and common, but still, it is important. You see, getting your poise broken will stagger you, but as we have seen before, with damage level, there are many types of staggers. So, if you ask me, the moment I know that my poise health is low, I will be looking to purposely take a light hit in order to get it to reset immediately with a short stagger. That way, when the big hits come, I am ready for the trade. Finally, I mentioned something about a hyper armor reset. Well, my dear viewer, I am not going to explain this reset condition just yet. The reason is simple. In order to understand how hyper armor resets our poise, we first need to understand what hyper armor actually is and how it actually works. Let's move on to that. Alright, hyper armor is probably going to be the most difficult concept that we're going to talk about in this video. The reason for this is because, quite frankly, it is an overly difficult, convoluted, and unfriendly mechanic. I don't enjoy the way that FromSoft decided to deal with hyper armor in this game, but it is what we have and it is what I will explain to you. To begin, we need to see where hyper armor fits within the poise mechanic. Hyper armor is a subsystem of player poise, and it represents a temporary boost to our character's maximum poise. This temporary boost to poise happens when we are in the middle of our weapon swing. Before swinging our weapon, our character has its passive poise through armor. Then, while swinging the weapon, hyper armor enters and we calculate how much we have. Finally, when the weapon attack ends, hyper armor exits and we are left with a set amount of passive poise. The game calculates our hyper armor when it enters, and then it calculates how much passive poise we have left once hyper armor exits. Hyper armor is specific in the sense that only certain moves have it, and among those that have it, hyper armor is active at different points of the attack and it lasts for different amounts of frames. The hyper armor of every move is unique. Some moves have early hyper armor while others have it activated later. The amount of frames that the hyper armor is active for also varies on a case-by-case scenario. Overall, we have to go and look for each specific move and see its parameters in order to find out if it has hyper armor and what type of characteristics it holds. That being said, we can make some generalized statements. Please take a look at this table. Here you will see an overview of which types of attacks get hyper armor. The first thing to notice is that we have to differentiate between attacks that use the character's passive armor poise and those that don't. If an attack uses the player's poise, then we have to apply the hyper armor formula in order to determine what the total poise will be during the attack. On the other hand, if the attack does not use the player's poise, then the game will assign them a predetermined fixed amount of hyper armor. These attacks will always have the same total poise regardless of the conditions. In the case of weapons, only certain weapons have hyper armor and they all use the player's armor poise, so we have to apply the hyper armor formula. Colossal swords and colossal weapons have hyper armor on all of their attacks, regardless of whether they are one-handed or two-handed. Then, we have the group of weapons that only get hyper armor when two-handed. Greatswords, curved greatswords, great axes, great hammers, great spears, hammers, flails, and halberds. Finally, we have the special case of the one-handed mace. This hammer-type armament actually has some hyper armor during its R2, both normal and charged. If a weapon type is not specified here, it does not have hyper armor in any of its attacks. Furthermore, I was not able to find any weapon attack that uses fixed hyper armor. From what I have seen, they all use the formula. Moving on to spells, they appear to behave opposite to the weapons. This means that the ones that I looked into always had a set amount of hyper armor. None of them used player poise and its corresponding formula. Some examples of spells that give the player hyper armor are Rock Blaster, Shatter Earth, Gavel of Haima, and Briars of Sin for sorceries. And then we have Dragon Maw, Dragon Claw, and 2 aspects of the Crucible, the Horn and the Tail, for incantations. When it comes to sorceries and incantations, these are just some examples. While not every spell has hyper armor, there are definitely some that do but are not in the table. This list serves to show a few options that the player has. Finally, Ashes of War. These are the most varied when it comes to their system. Some Ashes of War use the player's poise, meaning that we have to apply the formula, while others do not use player poise, so the game gives them a fixed hyper armor value. Sword Dance, Giant Hunt, Sacred Blade, and Carrion Grandeur are some Ashes of War that require the formulaic calculation of hyper armor, while Storm Stomp, Golden Land, Wild Strikes, and Gravitas are some examples of cases where the game gives them a fixed amount of hyper armor. There are way too many Ashes of War to list them all, so we are forced to look into the parameter of those that interest us. As mentioned before, this table is not exhaustive. The point is to show you the duality of the hyper armor system. Sometimes the amount of hyper armor depends on our poise and we have to calculate it, while others it is a predetermined value by the game. If the game gives an attack a predetermined amount of hyper armor, then it is what it is, and we do not have to worry. That said, if the attack uses our character's poise to determine how much hyper armor we will get, then the question is, how do we calculate it? First off, we need to see where we are in the process. Hyper armor is calculated during our weapon swing, and each attack has different amounts of hyper armor. As for the formula, it is the following. Bonus poise is equal to the inherent weapon poise multiplied by the hyper armor modifier minus the subtraction of 1 minus the armor factor multiplied by armor poise. This sounds horrible, doesn't it? That's because it is. Fortunately, we don't have to use this exact formula. I mean, it's the correct one, but it is too complicated to be immediately useful. This formula can be simplified into something a bit more comfortable. This is what we're actually going to use. Total poise is equal to passive poise divided by 2 plus the result of multiplying the inherent weapon poise multiplied by the hyper armor modifier. Now, if your character is using the Bull Goat Talisman, then we have to modify it a little bit to look like this. Total poise is equal to passive poise divided by 2 plus inherent weapon poise multiplied by hyper armor modifier, the result of which is multiplied by 1.33. These formulas are actually much easier to use. We still have to understand what these words mean, and we still have to find the attack's inherent weapon poise and the hyper armor modifier, but this information is much more readily available, all things considered. For the purposes of understanding the formula, the concepts can be defined as followed. Total poise is the amount of poise that our character will have during a hyper armor attack. It is basically passive poise plus the bonus we get from hyper armor. Inherent weapon poise is a predetermined value that Elden Ring gives to each weapon type for poise calculations. The higher the inherent weapon poise, the higher the amount of hyper armor we will get. For example, Colossal Swords have an inherent weapon poise of 90. The hyper armor modifier is also a value that is predetermined by Elden Ring, but this time it is there for each specific attack. It represents the resilience of an attack and it will result in more or less hyper armor received. It is similar to motion values in concept. R1s usually have a hyper armor modifier of 1, Rolling attacks usually have it at 0.75, and then we have charged R2s with a modifier of 2, providing us with massive amounts of hyper armor. Both the inherent weapon poise and the hyper armor modifier have to be looked up within the parameters of the attack that you're interested in. Once you have it, you plug these parameters and the poise stat of your character into the formula and you solve. Let me show you an example. How much total poise will we get through the hyper armor of a one-handed colossal sword R1 at 22 passive poise without the Bull Goat Talisman? Well, I can tell you that the inherent weapon poise of a colossal sword is 90, and the hyper armor modifier of a colossal sword R1 is 1. With this information, in combination with the 22 poise, we get the following. Total poise is equal to 22 divided by 2 plus 90 multiplied by 1. The result is 101 total poise. As you can see, in this case, hyper armor will allow us to tank any attack in a PvE scenario that does not ignore poise. This is very, very good, as hyper armor provides us with an additional 79 poise to make sure that we are not interrupted. Sure, it is temporary and it only lasts for this one single attack, but still, it is a huge amount of value. This is how you calculate the exact amount of poise that you will have during each hyper armor attack. If you ever find yourself in a position in which you need to do the work, then this is how it's done. Now, maybe you have some mathematical knowledge and saw this in the formulas that I showed you. Or maybe you have prior experience with Elden Ring's hyper armor system and have suffered this yourself. Regardless of the case, it is important to understand that in Elden Ring, hyper armor can actually be a nerf or a detriment to your character's poise. Indeed, there are some cases in which your character will actually lose poise when they do a specific attack with hyper armor. This is what is known as negative hyper armor, and it is one of the most obvious and frustrating flaws of this system. In all fairness, things used to be much worse than they are now, and FromSoft made an attempt to mitigate the effects of negative hyper armor in patch 1.07. Before this patch, a player would lose poise through hyper armor if they use a two-handed greatsword with more than 61 passive poise. It was horrible! So, in patch 1.07, FromSoft increased the inherent weapon poise of all weapons that take advantage of hyper armor. This resulted in fewer instances of negative hyper armor, but it did not eliminate them completely. I want to show you some of these examples that still exist in the current version of the game. These are the two cases that we will witness. First, we're going to see the effects of hyper armor when using a two-handed hammer running R1 with 80 passive poise. And then, we're going to see the effects of hyper armor when using a one-handed colossal sword guard counter with 100 passive poise. In the case of the hammer, the information that we need is that the inherent weapon poise of this weapon type is 52, and the hyper armor multiplier for this specific attack is 0.75. Next, we plug in this information in the formula and we get the following. Total poise is equal to 80 divided by 2 plus 52 multiplied by 0.75. We solve and we get that during this attack, hyper armor will bring our poise to a total of 79. This is 1 point less than the 80 that we started with before hyper armor came into effect. As you see, we lost 1 point of poise. This is negative hyper armor. For the colossal sword example, we do the same thing. Colossal swords have an inherent weapon poise of 90 and their guard counters have a hyper armor modifier of 0.5. We insert the information into the formula and we get the following. Total poise is equal to 100 divided by 2 plus 90 multiplied by 0.5. We solve and we will see that during this attack, hyper armor will bring our poise to a total of 95. This is 5 points less than the 100 passive poise that we started with. The result is obvious to see. Hyper armor takes some of our initial poise. Once again, this is the effect of negative hyper armor. While losing 1 or 5 passive poise may not seem like a lot, this is just a few examples. There are other cases with larger poise losses, and the worst part is that you could be planning a build to follow a specific poise threshold in order to be able to tank some king attacks, but then you find that you cannot do so because of negative hyper armor. By simply existing, negative hyper armor complicates the existence of some of the larger weapon types that need a working mechanic, and it adds to the frustration that the players feel with dealing with a seemingly capricious system. The fact of the matter is that negative hyper armor should not be a thing, and yet, here we are. Earlier in the video, we talked about how poise resets under certain conditions. I mentioned that there were 3 cases: the natural reset, the break reset, and the hyper armor reset. We went over the first 2, and I left the last one, the hyper armor reset, pending until we understood how hyper armor works. Well, this is that time, and we need to talk about how hyper armor can serve as a tool to help us recover our passive poise stat. The first thing to do is to situate ourselves in the hyper armor timeline. Hyper armor resets our poise at the moment that it stops being active. In other words, when our attacks lose hyper armor, that is when our poise is reset. It is at this time that the game calculates how much poise we have remaining after hyper armor exits our weapon attack. With this understood, the question is, how much poise do we actually get? Well, I really don't know. My dear viewer, I have tried to find the formula that the game uses in order to calculate how much passive poise our character gets after it uses hyper armor to tank an attack. I also tried to figure it out by applying the different parameters that affect hyper armor. I have found some evidence that the formula could be current poise minus 0.2 multiplied by the total hyper armor poise, or maybe it can be 0.8 multiplied by the total hyper armor poise minus the hyper armor bonus. That being said, I cannot, in good faith, tell you that either of these is 100% correct. The fact of the matter is that I have not been able to confirm a working formula with actual examples of calculations that I have solved with pen and paper on my desk. For this reason, I am not able to show you a proper formula. If any of you know or understand the exact formula that the game uses to determine the exact poise reset amount after hyper armor, do not hesitate to let me know in the comments below. I would be very happy to learn this. Now, while I may not be able to provide you with a 100% reliable formula, what I can do is bring your attention to the concept of minimum toughness. Minimum toughness is a parameter found within the game files that affects all attacks in the game, or at least all attacks that have hyper armor. Weapon attacks, Ashes of War, sorceries, and incantations that provide hyper armor all have the minimum toughness parameter. This parameter is usually at a value of 0.8 or a value of 1, and this parameter signifies the minimum amount of poise that your character will receive after doing a specific attack with hyper armor. In the case of minimum toughness, the 0.8 means that after a hyper armor attack, our poise will be reset to 80% of its maximum value. As for the 1, it means that after a hyper armor attack, our poise will be reset to 100% of its maximum value. That's right, having a minimum toughness of 1 represents a full and complete poise reset. For example, a Colossal Sword R1 has a minimum toughness of 0.8, meaning that we will get an 80% reset after the attack's hyper armor is finished. On the other hand, the Ash of War Storm Stomp has a minimum toughness of 1, so we will get a full poise reset after the skill finishes. So, in order to know the least amount of poise we are going to get after a hyper armor reset, we need to look at the minimum toughness of the attack that we just did. And this, my dear viewer, is something that we can actually test and prove through actual gameplay. Let me walk you through it. First of all, let's set the scene. I am over at Morn Castle to the south of the Weeping Peninsula fighting a Misbegotten. My character is using a Zweihander with the Ash of War Storm Stomp. My character is also wearing Malenia's winged helm, the Tree Sentinel armor, the Tree Sentinel gauntlets, and the Tree Sentinel greaves for its armor. Furthermore, I am using the Bull Goat's Talisman to increase our poise further to a total of 101 poise. Before we continue, I just want to note that the Bull Goat Talisman does not really increase our poise, instead it decreases incoming poise damage. That said, for the sake of simplicity and to make the example easier to understand, we are going to use the poise increase as it appears in the game. Later in the video, we will do a full explanation of the Bull Goat's Talisman true effect. Now, the Misbegotten that I am fighting has an attack where he goes up into the air and comes down with a splitting cleaver attack. This move deals 100 poise damage. Finally, as I mentioned before, I am using the Ash of War Storm Stomp, which has a minimum toughness parameter of 1, and this means a full poise reset after hyper armor. You got all of this? Good. The theory says that I should be able to tank one of these attacks that deal 100 poise damage, leaving me with only 1 poise health left. Then I will use Storm Stomp, which will give me a flat hyper armor value of 300, and then it should bring me back all the way to 101 poise thanks to the full reset of its minimum toughness. Finally, with my poise reset, I should be able to, once again, tank the jumping cleaver attack, putting me at 1 poise health one more time. All of this must be done within 30 seconds in order to avoid my poise being reset through its natural timer. Are you ready to see it? Prepare yourself, and here we go. Step 1 complete. I got hit by the jumping cleaver attack, tanked it, and took 100 poise damage, leaving me with 1 poise health left. Furthermore, the 30-second timer for a natural poise reset begins. Step 2 complete. I managed to use Storm Stomp successfully without taking any further poise damage. This should bring my poise health from 1 all the way to 101 thanks to Storm Stomp's minimum toughness parameter of 1. The poise reset through hyper armor in this case should be 100%, and that means that I should be able to tank the next hit. Step 3 complete. I got hit by the same jumping cleaver attack and took another 100 poise damage, yet my character did not stagger. This could only be possible if I had received a full poise reset in order to bring me back to 101 poise. Furthermore, this was done before the 30-second timer concluded, meaning that there was no natural poise reset. This, my dear viewer, proves that hyper armor resets your poise. Also, it proves that Storm Stomp's minimum toughness parameter of 1 led to a full 100% reset. In conclusion, we can use this to our advantage by looking into the parameters of our favorite attacks and figuring out which ones reset our poise so that we can then use them purposefully to keep on tanking more and more hits. Make sure to take advantage of this. Moving on to the next concept, we are going to take a look at Super Armor. Super Armor is a mechanic that we can find within the general poise system of Elden Ring, but it makes it very clear that it has nothing to do with player poise. Super Armor is the name used by the community to describe this mechanic, but it should not be confused with the Super Armor parameter that Elden Ring uses for stance. This is something completely different. Super Armor in the game files is represented by the parameter Jump Table 24. Super Armor has the effect of making the player immune to staggers, but this does not happen because it gives the character infinite poise. In fact, it happens because it makes the character immune to damage level. Since damage level is the mechanic that governs the different staggers in the game, and Super Armor makes the character immune to it, then we will see that no matter what attack hits us, our character will never be interrupted if the attack has Super Armor. The best example of an attack that has super armor is the Ash of War Lion's Claw. From the moment the attack begins until the very last frame, this attack cannot be interrupted. There are other good examples for this mechanic, like the Thundercloud Form skill and the incantation Dragon Maw, and these two serve as good visuals to explain that super armor tends to affect attacks that have airborne frames. Usually, super armor is used to avoid having the character interrupted in the middle of an attack while it's in the air. For this reason, super armor frames tend to be limited only to the frames in which your character is in the air. It makes sense, seeing as how the parameter is called jump table. So, as a general rule of thumb, if your character has some kind of poise while it's in the air, what you're looking at is super armor. But going back to Lion's Claw, this attack has super armor throughout its whole duration for some unknown reason. It is an exception, and that makes it extremely powerful. And speaking of exceptions, I want to make a special mention about the Ash of War Endure. This skill also offers the player super armor in full capacity. It also makes the player immune to all damage levels, and as a result makes it impossible to be staggered. That said, Endure does not have any airborne frames in its animation, so it does not get super armor through the use of Jump Table 24. Instead, it receives this effect through a special effect. Usually they are special effects 1650 or 1655. It is important to understand this because while super armor will be most commonly found in attacks that go into the air, there are still some that offer the full benefits from the ground. Another example is the Oath of Vengeance skill from the Grafted Blade. Super armor is really good, so you should investigate if your favorite attacks have access to it. My dear viewer, I want to show you something. Take a look at this. What is going on here? This character is naked, meaning that it has 0 poise, and yet it was able to tank this enemy's attack. Furthermore, I did a two-handed Scythe R1. This attack does not have any kind of hyper armor or Jump Table 24 super armor, and yet, again, I managed to tank the attack. Why does this happen? Well, what you are seeing is the effect of a very specific type of super armor called 6360. Special Effect 6360 is a type of super armor that is only found in certain very specific attacks. The example that I showed you is a two-handed Scythe. This weapon has 6360 super armor on its two-handed R1s, R2s, both running attacks, as well as its rolling and backstep R1s. And what does 6360 super armor do exactly? Well, it makes your character immune to damage levels 1 and 8. This means that your character cannot be staggered by these two damage levels, which correspond to the weakest attacks in the game. Think of daggers and straight swords. Now, while this is very nice to have, it is also very situational, so any other damage level will go straight through the 6360 super armor. Furthermore, the activity of this special super armor varies between attacks. In the case of the Scythe, is about 7 or 8 frames long. With all of this said, it is still a useful characteristic to have, and it pays to keep it in mind. There are other cases of 6360 super armor in this game. I can tell you that the charged R2 of the Raptor Talons also has about 14 frames of it. Still, 6360 is not full power super armor, and it has some very clear weaknesses. That being said, it is useful and should definitely be taken into consideration when using these weapons. After all, damage levels 1 and 8 are very commonly found throughout the weaker enemies in the game. At this point in the video, you should know everything there is to know about Poise in Elden Ring, from the most basic concepts all the way to the most detailed information. The only thing left to do is go over a few cases that the game provides us in order to increase our poise past the natural limits of our armor. These cases allow us to tank hits that would normally be impossible, and they provide additional tactical advantages to consider. I want to go over 4 of these cases: the Bull Goat Talisman, the Baldachin Blessing and its radiant counterpart, the Leaden Hardtear from the Flask of Physics, and the Ironjar Aromatic consumable. Starting with the Bull Goat Talisman, this is the only permanent increase to poise that we have available in the game. The game establishes that this talisman increases our poise, and if we do the math, it represents an increase of 33%. Now, while this is what the game tells you and shows you in the stats page of your character, this is not what is actually happening mechanically. In reality, the Bull Goat Talisman decreases incoming poise damage by 25%. Instead of the character getting more poise, the enemies deal less poise damage to us. While it is true that in the large scheme of things, a 33 poise increase achieves a similar result than a 25% poise damage reduction, it is important to understand the difference. The Bull Goat Talisman does not give you any poise, so using it with zero passive poise is completely useless. Furthermore, the fact that it reduces incoming poise damage instead of giving you more poise also alters hyper armor calculations to some extent. So yeah, it is important. I honestly do not know why the game does this. It should just say the truth and tell us about the factual effect of Bull Goat. The second case that I want to cover is the Baldachin Blessing. In this section, we will also talk about its stronger version, the Radiant Baldachin Blessing. Both of these items have the same effects. It is just that the Radiant version is stronger in one of them. They provide 3 total effects. 2 of them are identical and 1 of them is boosted in the Radiant Blessing. The first effect is identical in both versions of the item, and it is that our character will receive a boost to its physical damage absorption of 35%. The second effect is almost identical, and it is that both of these items make your character immune to damage level 1 and 8, meaning that they cannot be staggered from these types of attacks. Indeed, the Baldachin buffs give your character 6360 super armor for the duration of their effect. And finally, both versions of the item increase our character's poise. The normal version of the item increases it by about 50%. While the Radiant version of it increases by about 80%. Now, it is important to understand that this effect is similar to the one offered by the Bull Goat Talisman. This means that while the game tells us that they increase our poise, what they really do is decrease incoming poise damage. So, in this way, the true effect of the normal Baldachin Blessing is that it lowers incoming poise damage by 33%. While the true effect of the Radiant version is that it lowers incoming poise damage by 55%. This also means that since they do not provide us with any actual poise, using these items with zero passive poise will be useless. Again, I am not sure why the game does this, but it is important to be aware of the situation. In any case, the Baldachin Blessing has a duration of 15 seconds, while the Radiant version of this item has a duration of 70 seconds. Next up is the Leaden Hardtear. Probably the most accessible of these poise-altering mechanics, we have it available through the Flask of Physics. The game says that the Leaden Hardtear increases our character's poise, but this is simply incorrect. This tier does not increase our poise at all. What it does is give our character partial super armor. Specifically, this tier makes our character immune to damage levels 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. If you recall from when we spoke about damage level, these numbers belong to the types of stagger in the game. The Leaden Hardtear makes it so that our character cannot be staggered at all. That said, even with the Leaden Hardtear, our character is still vulnerable to knockdowns. This means that damage level 6, 7, and 9, or as I like to call them, the Fling, the Flap, and the Flip, will still affect our character. Overall, it is a very useful tool because damage levels 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8 are very common in the game, so it will protect us from most attacks that we will face. The only bad part is that it does not last for very long. Its duration is a measly 10 seconds. And finally, let's talk about the Ironjar Aromatic. This is a perfumer recipe that gives us the old school iron flesh effects. In Elden Ring, this perfume gives us an additional 40% physical damage absorption, it lowers our lightning absorption by 60%, it increases all of our resistances by 45%, reduces our character speed, and forces us to heavy roll. That said, these effects are not the subject of the video, so what does it actually do to poise? For starters, it does not give our character any amount of poise. Indeed, it does not increase our poise. What it does do is give our character hardness level 4. This is a completely different mechanic that I explain in detail in another video. I will leave a link in the description so that you can check it out. That said, for the purposes of this video, hardness level 4 will make most enemy attacks in the game bounce off your character. Now, what about those attacks that don't bounce off? Well, the Ironjar Aromatic also gives our character partial super armor, much like the Leaden Hardtear. It makes our character immune to damage levels 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8, so most attacks in the game will not cause a stagger. There is more though, as this buff also weakens all knockdowns. With the Ironjar Aromatic, all knockdowns attacks of damage level 6, 7, and 9 are changed and reduced to damage level 5, meaning a push stagger. That's right, knockdowns are changed to simple push staggers. This is very powerful, as knockdowns are some of the most troublesome attacks that we can get hit by. In terms of defensive power, this is an extremely good buff, but it does have its weaknesses. In any case, this is all packed in a duration of 40 seconds. And this is it. You now understand absolutely everything that I do in regards to poise. You know as much as I do and can use this information to improve both your skills and your build. When I started this video, I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into. Poise is an absolute titan of a mechanic, and it has so many things going on that it is simply too complicated and at times confusing. I do not think that this is good design, and yet you, my dear viewer, graced me with your company and watched the video until the very end. Judging by how long this guide is, I am impressed and most importantly, honored. Please accept my most sincere gratitude for your patience and your support. And I truly hope that this information has been useful to you and your journey through the lands between. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I get to see you on the next one.